The man known to history as Robert Edward Lee was born on the 19th of January, 1807 in Stratford Hall, Virginia. His father was Henry Lee III, who was born into a privileged family and was also a famous American Revolutionary War hero. Henry Lee grew up in one of the foremost families in Virginia, as his mother, Lucy Grimes, was once courted by George Washington, while his father, Henry Lee II, bred horses. When Henry III turned 14, he attended Princeton with other founding fathers like Aaron Burr and James Madison, standing out amongst his peers. It was during this time that Henry Lee came wrapped up in revolutionary sentiment and joined the Continental Army. He climbed through the ranks and earned the nickname Light Horse Harry, following the cavalry charge he led at the Battle of Paulus Hook, New Jersey, which drew the attention of George Washington. Following the war, he served as the governor of Virginia. Robert E. Lee's mother was Anne Hill Carter, who was born into a prestigious and wealthy plantation family. Anne's father, Charles Carter, was a fifth-generation plantation owner of the Shirley Plantation. Anne Carter married Henry Lee III during his governorship on the 18th of June, 1793, in the governor's mansion, Color Room. Following his retirement from the governorship, Anne moved in with Henry Lee at the family's holdings. Together, the couple had a total of 6 children, but only 5 survived into adulthood, with Robert E. Lee being the 5th child. Born when Robert E. Lee was only 1, the family fell on hard times as the main source of income, the Stratford Plantation, was taken via entail and given to Henry's son from his first marriage, Henry Lee IV. The lost revenue was just one financial disaster that fell upon the family, as Henry Lee had terrible luck in land speculation and ended up in debtor's jail twice while protecting one of his friends who opposed the War of 1812. Henry Lee was injured severely and left the family to recover. Robert E. Lee would not see his father again, as he died on the 25th of March, 1818, on Cumberland Island, Georgia, whilst trying to reunite with his family. Ultimately, Robert's father became known simply as the man who wrote Washington a bad check. He spent his time with his widowed mother in a modest home, though this was only possible due to the Carters leaving a small legacy to sustain her. The family lived at the Ravensworth Plantation, which was owned by one of Anne's relatives, William Henry Fitzhugh. Ravensworth Plantation would serve as the backdrop for Lee's depressing childhood, as the house was on the outskirts of Alexandria in the swampy, mosquito-infested, and unhealthy part of town. The house's interior was never painted while the Lees resided there, and they did not live alone, as they frequently shared with boarders. Lee did not live a privileged childhood, but he had fond memories of his pet lobster and hummingbird, which began his love of animals, yet they sadly both passed on the same day. Lee spent his summers swimming in the Potomac and playing in the local springs. He attended a plantation school in Fauquier County before attending the Alexandria Academy at the age of 14. He received an excellent education whilst attending the Alexandria Academy, learning literature, algebra, as well as the classics. Lee's family was well connected to the Virginia aristocracy. This led to Fitzhugh penning a letter to United States Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, imploring that he allow Lee a spot at the United States Military Academy, West Point. Fitzhugh had Lee deliver the letter personally to Calhoun, which resulted in Lee being enrolled at West Point in 1825. For all of Lee's life, he had lived in the world of slavery, and now that he would be attending West Point, he would be entering a world where slavery was all but extinct. But despite the Lees' financial situation, they maintained 4 slaves left in her father. Lee was accustomed to being surrounded by slaves, but as he went further north, the number of enslaved blacks lessened, and whilst they were still not equal, many held freedoms Lee was not accustomed to. West Point at the time focused heavily on engineering thanks to its superintendent, Brevet Major Sylvanus Thayer. Before there had arrived at West Point, it was marred with drunkenness, disorder, and riots, but he transformed the academy into a prestigious institution. He introduced the famed cadet uniform with gray coats, starched white trousers, and plumed black leather hats with polished brass scales for the chin straps. When Lee arrived in June of 1825, there were roughly 200 cadets who would be given an exam intended to weed out those who were idiots and misfits. Following that, the cadets who made it through the examination were paired with 3 other cadets who shared a tent together. The tent mates had to purchase a joint toilet, a looking glass, a washstand and a pitcher, tin pail, broom, and a scrubbing brush. The quality of the food was often described as poor, yet Lee never complained about it. Wealthier cadets who snuck out at West Point would visit Gridley's Tavern to eat, drink, and smoke. Most who went out would be given a demerit, but Lee never received any demerits, accomplishing a feat few others achieved. The curriculum consisted heavily of mathematics and French, as mathematics was crucial for military officers of the era, whilst France was the only ally to the United States, and most military textbooks were in French. The Marquis de Lafayette often visited West Point to inspect the cadets, and these visits inspired Lee, as Lafayette and his father, Henry, had fought together in the American Revolution, bringing 18th century heroes into evolving 19th century military tactics. Lee's daily regime at West Point started at 5:30 a.m. with the Reveille, following a full day of mathematics and French classes, along with hours of independent studies. The cadets finished their day with full-dressed drills, parade, and inspections. The cadets' day would officially end at 10 p.m., and whilst all cadets maintained a busy schedule, Lee made many friends during his time at West Point. One such friend was troublemaking third-year cadet Jefferson Davis, who was caught going off grounds to the local tavern to get drunk. He was only allowed to remain due to his previous good standing. When Lee's first year at West Point finished, he was third in his class and achieved a rating of 285 1/4 out of 300 total points available. He was placed on a list with the other distinguished cadets, and Lee's status among the good and the great was odd for a man new to the academy. His reputation would earn him the nickname Marble Man for his emotionless expressions, whether he won or lost. When Lee's second year's drawing was included in the curriculum, officers were expected to be able to draw a usable map. Lee was made a senior cadet and tutored many of his fellow cadets in mathematics. He was enamored by the campaigns of Napoleon Bonaparte and read multiple books about his campaigns. Many of these books were new to the United States, showing the impressive collection West Point had. Also, Lee's ability to read French with relative ease allowed him access to these texts, as they would not have been translated into English. Many of Napoleon's tactics would be used by Lee on the battlefield, as, like Napoleon, he refused to fight on the defensive and preferred to use rapid attacks and bold flanking maneuvers. Following Lee's second year, he maintained second-place standing in his class and applied for leave to visit his mother, who now lived with Lee's oldest brother, Charles Carter Lee, in Georgetown. His mother's health had greatly deteriorated since Lee went away to West Point, and when he came home, he took control of her care. Lee returned in 1827 for his third year at West Point and added physics and chemistry to his course list. Lee was introduced to battalion tactics and artillery use on the battlefield. He enhanced his knowledge by reading Machiavelli, Hamilton, Rousseau, and John Paul Jones. His wide command of different subjects outside of the military or engineering made him a special officer, though he remained in second place in his class. When Lee started his final year, he was given the position of adjutant of the Corps, which is the highest position a cadet can hold. He would take his final exam on the 1st of June, 1828, finishing second once again to Charles Mason. Upon graduating, Lee was given his choice of commission as a lieutenant in the Engineer Corps, a prize worthy of a top student at West Point. Though for all of Lee's life, he had lived in the world of slavery, and now that he would be attending West Point, he would be entering a world where slavery was all but extinct. But despite the Lee's financial situation, they maintained 4 slaves left in her father. Lee was accustomed to being surrounded by slaves, but as he went further north, the number of enslaved blacks lessened, and whilst they were still not equal, many held freedoms Lee was not accustomed to. West Point at the time focused heavily on engineering thanks to its superintendent, Brevet Major Sylvanus Thayer. Before there had arrived at West Point, it was marred with drunkenness, disorder, and riots, but he transformed the academy into a prestigious institution. He introduced the famed cadet uniform with gray coats, starched white trousers, and plumed black leather hats with polished brass scales for the chin straps. When Lee arrived in June of 1825, there were roughly 200 cadets who would be given an exam intended to weed out those who were idiots and misfits. Following that, the cadets who made it through the examination were paired with 3 other cadets who shared a tent together. The tent mates had to purchase a joint toilet, a looking glass, a washstand and a pitcher, tin pail, broom, and a scrubbing brush. The quality of the food was often described as poor, yet Lee never complained about it. Wealthier cadets who snuck out at West Point would visit Gridley's Tavern to eat, drink, and smoke. Most who went out would be given a demerit, but Lee never received any demerits, accomplishing a feat few others achieved. The curriculum consisted heavily of mathematics and French, as mathematics was crucial for military officers of the era, whilst France was the only ally. Even getting involved in the labor himself, although most of his work would be destroyed by a storm. After the labor season ended, Major Babcock would not return to Cockspur, as he was replaced with Lieutenant J.F. Mansfield. Mansfield lacked confidence to complete the project and in turn would be replaced with Captain Delafield. Lee and Delafield immediately began outlining new plans for the fort, with Lee acting as the draftsman. Savannah would teach Lee a valuable lesson with regards to the sedated decision-making of the Corps of Engineers and how projects lacked sufficient funds and were located in the worst places possible. He felt that if a situation was hopeless, you should remove yourself from the situation, and so Lee used his connections in Washington to get him reassigned to Old Point, Virginia, at Fort Monroe. Transferring to Fort Monroe would bring him closer to Mary, and his smart decision-making would set him apart from others. On his way to Fort Monroe, Lee visited Arlington to see Mary, and whilst there, he finally convinced her father to let them marry. Mary took Lee to the dining room to eat, and Lee asked Mary if she would marry him. The couple would marry on the 30th of June, 1831, and Mary decided to share Lee's quarters at Fort Monroe. She did so, and they lived there completely on their own without any support from her father. The two were quite unique, as Mary had a tendency to boss Lee around the house, something unusual in the era. Nonetheless, the two maintained a strong bond, and it was during this time that the Lees acquired a place in Arlington, a location which enabled him to put down roots, something he never had during his childhood. The Arlington House, as it would be later called, was heavily inspired by Lee's relative's house, Mount Vernon, or George Washington's plantation. The couple moved into Lee's quarters at Fort Monroe in August of 1831, but his ability to work would be affected by problems with the authority of the garrison. Between the fort and school leader, Brevet Colonel Eustis, and the engineer leader, Captain Andrew Talcott, disputes rose frequently between the two men, mainly because the laborers for the engineering corps were disruptive to military procedures, which vexed Brevet Colonel Eustis. Despite the conflict between the Army and the engineers, Lee excelled and took on vast amounts of responsibility despite his inferior rank to many other officers. Lee worked hard to complete Fort Monroe, which would become known as the Gibraltar of Chesapeake Bay, and it was during this time at Fort Monroe that America's only effective slave revolt occurred in Southampton, County, Virginia, which became known as the Nat Turner Rebellion. Nat Turner was an educated slave who preached to other slaves about the evils of slavery and how one day God would release them from their chains, allowing them to enact their revenge against their owners. An eclipse gave Turner the sign he was looking for, and he started his rebellion on the 21st of August, 1831. As a result of the rebellion, Fort Monroe received 3 companies of artillery to deter any further rebellions. This event would shock the South, as the myth of happy slaves was ultimately laid to rest. It also resulted in stricter laws regarding the freedom of slaves. Robert E. Lee was always consistent regarding his view on slavery and its effects on society. He was never an enthusiastic supporter, and in a letter to Mary, he stated that, quote, "Slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country. It is useless to expiate on its disadvantages. I think it, however, a greater evil to the white man than to the black race. And while my feelings are strongly enlisted on behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more strong for the former. Although Lee expressed disapproval of the institution of slavery, he still held the common view in the latter half of his letter that, quote, "The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise and merciful providence." He held a young, moderate Southern gentleman's view on slavery. While he agreed that slavery was immoral, he believed that the problem of slavery would be handled by God in his time, and it was not the responsibility of politicians or slave owners to answer the question. While Lee's approach was more of inaction towards the institution, despite his objection to it, others would take a different approach. Henry Clay, John Randolph, and Richard Bland founded the American Colonization Society to sponsor the creation of Liberia to send free blacks back to Africa in order to satisfy slave owners. They were to be compensated for the loss of their slaves. Ultimately, the Liberia plan failed in its initial goal, and as tensions rose, it was written off as a slaveholder scheme. The politics at Fort Monroe continued, and despite Lee's low rank, he always seemed to have more influence than senior officers, such as Colin Eustis. This is believed to be because General Gracio, the chief of the Corps of Engineers, had more political sway in Washington, D.C. over the chief of artillery. Lee would lead the project to extend and reinforce a 15-acre artificial island, which would eventually become Fort Wool. This new fort would be used to support and defend Fort Monroe with crossfire at enemy vessels. Though the work was steady, he gained no joy from it and began to doubt his choice to join the military. The new soldiers who arrived at Fort Monroe brought new social life, primarily in the form of drinking, although Lee would abstain for the most part and never understood the obsession with getting drunk. Unlike many of his fellow young officers, he was never seen to being stuffy and was considered to be great company to be around. He kept his distance from his peers and was a reserved man. Mary would visit Lee at Fort Monroe in June of 1832, and it would be during this time that the couple would announce the impending arrival of their first child. The Lee's first child would be George Washington Custis Lee, who was named after his grandfather, George Washington's adopted son. Mary would spend much of her time raising him at Arlington. Between 1832 and 1834, Lee would essentially take charge of the engineers at Fort Monroe from his friend and superior, Captain Talcott, who was frequently absent. Yet his time would be short at Fort Monroe, as in 1834, Lee would be transferred to Washington, D.C. to the War Department. Lee found the office work at the War Department to be monotonous, with the chances of being promoted relatively slim, while the pay was even worse. But he would enjoy the birth of his first daughter, Mary Custis Lee, in 1835. During this time, General Gracio hardly visited the project sites, leaving Lee in charge of overseeing their progress. He was bound by endless red tape and would only be saved from the paperwork when he was dispatched to assist his old friend, Captain Talcott, in the Midwest Territories in 1835. In the state of Ohio and the territory of Michigan, fighting broke out over a small section of land known as the Toledo Strip. The Toledo Strip spanned 500 square miles and included the important port of Toledo. This conflict would eventually result in the Toledo War, which was little more than a brief skirmish, as the only injury was a Michigan deputy who was stabbed by a boy with a penknife during the dispute. Captain Talcott and Lieutenant Lee surveyed the area to better determine the boundaries of Ohio and Michigan, and ultimately Michigan lost the Toledo Strip to Ohio, but in return, it received the Upper Peninsula, which would be the cause of the rivalry between Ohio and Michigan. Following his surveying of the Ohio and Michigan border, Lee was dispatched to St. Louis to solve a major problem. The Mississippi River was cutting a new channel that threatened the port that brought trade to St. Louis, and Lee was the only suitable candidate to tackle the assignment. The port of St. Louis was an important transportation site, as many Americans who traveled west to California and Oregon would meet there, and should Lee fail, westward expansion might come to a complete halt. Lee had two objectives: save the ports and waterfront and remove as many trees as possible from a 200-mile stretch of the Mississippi along the Missouri-Iowa border. The technology, navigational engineering, was still in its infancy during Lee's time in St. Louis, and Lee needed to find a way to curb the river's natural will to change direction. The Corps of Engineers had dumped tons of box sand around Bloody Island in order to push the current towards St. Louis and away from the new channel. But the boxes were smashed, which only worsened the situation by increasing the bar. After the wooden boxes failed, they tried using teams of oxen to dredge up the sand, yet that attempt too would ultimately fail. The river was not impossible to tame, as Lee had learned many lessons and knew that he must create areas that were strong enough to channel the current that would also create resistance to destroy the bar. He reflected back to his days at West Point, specifically a French textbook on hydrodynamics, and used that as his inspiration for the project. The original idea was to use the undergrowth to snag debris that floated down the Mississippi. The Lees had their third child on the 31st of May, 1837, this time a boy, William Fitzhugh Lee. Despite being overjoyed at the newest addition to the family, the pay Lee was receiving in the Army was slowly lessening his ability to take care of his family properly. But Lee's work in St. Louis was not unnoticed, and in July of 1838, he was promoted to the rank of captain in the Army. In the summer of 1839, on the 18th of June, the Lees welcomed their fourth child, Anne Carter Lee, to the family. However, his work in St. Louis would be stopped by angry Illinois citizens who opened fire at his workers with cannons out of fear that the progress Lee was making would cut them out of the increasingly lucrative trading along the Mississippi. The Illinois citizens had hoped to prevent the growth of St. Louis in order to force trade through their city. An injunction was issued by the Second Illinois Circuit, halting all work on Bloody Island. Lee had worked hard to improve the conditions along the Mississippi, but by the summer of Lee was reassigned to New York City to oversee the reconstruction of Forts Hamilton and Lafayette, along with the coastal battery positions on Staten Island. Restoring these fortifications was considered vitally important, as the only serious threat to American authority at the time was Great Britain, the sole nation with the capability to project military power across the Atlantic and challenge the United States on its own shores. Before his arrival in New York, the Lee family welcomed their fifth child, Eleanor Agnes Lee, born on February 27, 1841. Lee's duties in New York were deemed significant enough that it was expected his family would join him. However, Mary Custis Lee did not move immediately. Her reluctance was criticized by many, as it was generally expected that an officer's wife would accompany her husband wherever duty called him. In Mary's defense, she had borne 5 children between 1832 and 1841 and suffered from arthritis and persistent poor health. She eventually joined Lee in New York in the spring of 1843, but soon returned home after discovering she was pregnant again. Their sixth child, Robert E. Lee, Jr., was born on October 27, 1843, while Lee remained in New York, fully absorbed in his work on the fortifications. Though Lee was a highly skilled military engineer, he had achieved few accomplishments that brought him significant public recognition. One notable exception came in 1844, when he was appointed to the Board of Examiners at West Point. For 2 weeks, Lee evaluated and judged the final examinations of cadets alongside Major General Winfield Scott, the commanding officer of the U.S. Army. Scott was a towering figure, both physically and historically. A hero of the War of 1812, he was famously nicknamed Old Fuss and Feathers. Unlike many officers who attempted to flatter Scott to gain favor, Lee relied on his intelligence, professionalism, and quiet competence. This approach proved effective. Scott formed a favorable impression of Lee, a connection that would benefit him greatly in the years to come. Between 1844 and 1846, Lee served as a congressional liaison for the Chief of Engineers while continuing his duties in New York. He was also appointed to the Board of Engineers for the Atlantic Coast Defense. During this period, in early 1846, Mary gave birth to the Lee family's final child, Mildred Child Lee, affectionately known as Millie. The active service Lee desired would soon arrive as tensions escalated in the American West. The United States and Mexico were vying for dominance over rapidly expanding Western territories. The roots of the conflict dated back to 1810, when Moses Austin received permission from the Mexican government to establish an American settlement in Texas. Mexico had hoped these settlers would act as a buffer against Comanche raids, but instead, American immigration overwhelmed Mexican authority. The Mexican government's inability to control the settlers contributed to political upheaval, culminating in the rise of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, often called the Napoleon of the West. Santa Anna alternated between threatening military action against American settlers and offering them additional land. Eventually, he followed through with his threats. From February 23 to March 6, 1836, Santa Anna's forces besieged the Alamo. Roughly 100 defenders held off a Mexican army of about 1,500, but the mission ultimately fell. While women and children were spared, the male defenders were killed, sparking outrage in the United States and giving rise to the rallying cry, "Remember the Alamo." Soon after, Texan forces defeated the Mexican army at the Battle of San Jacinto, forcing Mexico to recognize Texas as an independent republic. A decade later, in 1845, Texas was annexed by the United States. Mexico reacted with fury, severing diplomatic ties, while many Northern Americans opposed the addition of another slave state to the Union. President James K. Polk sought to preserve diplomacy in hopes of purchasing California and New Mexico, but Mexico's political instability undermined negotiations. The presidency changed hands 4 times, the Ministry of War 6 times, and the Finance Ministry 16 times in a short span. Despite this chaos, resentment over the loss of Texas unified the Mexican people. The dispute over the U.S.-Mexico border further inflamed tensions. Mexico claimed the border lay along the Nueces River, while the United States asserted it was the Rio Grande. Polk ordered Brigadier General Zachary Taylor to occupy the contested territory. When a Mexican cavalry unit attacked Taylor's forces, killing 16 Americans in what became known as the Thornton Affair, Polk declared that American blood had been shed on American soil. General Taylor responded swiftly, defeating Mexican forces at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. American superiority in weaponry, particularly mobile horse artillery and the Colt revolver, proved decisive. The outbreak of war finally presented Lee with the opportunity for active service and advancement. On August 19, 1846, Lee was dispatched to San Antonio de Bexar, Texas, to report to Brigadier General John E. Wool. En route, Lee learned that General Taylor had captured Monterey and agreed to an 8-week armistice. Many officers, including Lee, believed the truce merely allowed Santa Anna time to regroup and train new forces. Their suspicions were confirmed when President Polk canceled the armistice on November 18th. Lee and the army advanced deep into enemy territory, arriving near Saltillo just before Christmas. Lee led a reconnaissance mission to locate Mexican positions, displaying remarkable persistence and determination. His efforts impressed General Wool, who appointed him acting inspector general. From this experience, Lee learned the value of thorough reconnaissance and skepticism towards exaggerated intelligence reports. As Wool moved to support Taylor at Buena Vista, where 5,000 Americans defeated Santa Anna's force of 14,000, Lee departed to join General Scott on January 17th. Upon arrival, Lee was welcomed into Scott's inner circle and assigned to his general staff. He quartered aboard the flagship USS Massachusetts, sharing accommodations with his former West Point classmate, Joseph E. Johnston. Scott commanded a force of approximately 12,000 men for the invasion of Veracruz. The fleet sailed to the Lobos Islands on February 19, 1847, but delays caused by smallpox outbreaks and severe storms postponed the operation. Finally, on March 5th, the fleet arrived off Veracruz, where Lee first saw the formidable fortress of San Juan de Ulua guarding the harbor. While surveying the beaches on board the Patrita, Lee's ship drifted too close to the fortress, drawing fire from its guns. This marked the first time in Lee's 25-year military career that he came under enemy fire. American troops landed unopposed on March 9th, and on the night of March 22nd, U.S. mortars began their bombardment. By March 27th, Veracruz had fallen. Lee's first experience of combat left him deeply unsettled. Writing to Mary, he described the scene as awful, expressing particular sorrow for the suffering of women and children. Lee never sought glory for its own sake, and the realities of war weighed heavily on him. With Veracruz secured, Scott turned his attention towards Mexico City, 280 miles inland. Supply lines were dangerously thin, and intelligence on Santa Anna's whereabouts was scarce. Santa Anna had returned to Mexico City after his defeat at Buena Vista and raised a new army of 12,000 men. Scott advanced with 6,000 troops and encountered Santa Anna at Cerro Gordo, where the Mexican general occupied a strong defensive position. During reconnaissance, Lee identified a concealed pathway that could bypass the enemy's left flank. Scott accepted Lee's plan and entrusted him with guiding the attacking division. The assault began on April 18, 1847. Although the troops were nearly discovered the night before, they managed to seize the high ground at La Talaya. The ensuing battle resulted in a decisive American victory, with comparatively light casualties. Lee's conduct at the Battle of Cerro Gordo earned him a brevet promotion to major and widespread praise from his commanders. He continued the campaign towards Mexico City alongside Scott, as well as Lieutenants P.G. Beauregard and George McClellan. After a brief engagement at Molino del Rey, the Army prepared for its next major objective, the assault on Chapultepec, the fortress overlooking Mexico City. The capture of Chapultepec would allow American forces to launch continuous assaults toward Mexico City. As a senior engineer, Lee argued strongly against a direct frontal assault on the fortress, warning of unnecessary casualties. However, his objections were overruled, and he was assigned to guide General Pillow's division along the western flank of Chapultepec. The first assault was repelled by fierce Mexican resistance, but the second attack succeeded. Lee personally climbed the steep slope under fire, accompanied by Lieutenant James Longstreet. During the assault, George Pickett was wounded, yet he managed to help General Pillow away from the battlefield. With the fall of Chapultepec, organized Mexican resistance largely collapsed. Mexico City, however, would not be fully pacified for 2 more days, partly because Santa Anna released armed criminals from the city's prisons, plunging the capital into chaos. The conclusion of the campaign was somber. Many Americans felt uneasy, believing that Mexico had been bullied throughout the war. For his actions at Chapultepec, Lee was promoted to brevet colonel and eventually returned home on June 29, 1848. It had taken Lee roughly 32 years from his entry as a cadet at West Point to rise to the rank of brevet colonel. Compared to many of his contemporaries, his advancement was only slightly faster than average. Though he did not receive a permanent promotion, his reputation earned him an appointment as superintendent of West Point in 1850. While this was a major professional achievement and a testament to his abilities as a leader and educator, Lee was not enthusiastic about the position. He complained to his friend P.G.T. Beauregard that overseeing West Point offered an impossibility of either giving or receiving satisfaction. Nevertheless, Lee applied himself diligently to the task. He worked to improve the cavalry program by lobbying for new stables and a riding practice ring. It is possible that Lee personally designed these facilities, as they closely resembled the stables at his home in Arlington. Under his leadership, West Point produced some of the finest cavalry officers of the era. Lee cared deeply about the cadets' welfare, but he refused to coddle them, believing leniency would result in weak officers. Cadets at West Point were notorious for mischief, rowdiness, and indiscipline. To maintain order, Lee relied on strict discipline, including corporal punishment in serious cases and expulsion when necessary. Cadets who lacked the qualities needed to become officers were allowed to resign. Despite these efforts, many of West Point's disciplinary problems persisted during Lee's 2.5-year tenure. In March 1855, Lee finally received his first true promotion when Secretary of War Jefferson Davis offered him the rank of lieutenant colonel in the newly formed 2nd Cavalry Regiment. This promotion required Lee to leave the Corps of Engineers, a move he had long desired, but it also meant separation from his family. His assignment to Texas would prove deeply unpleasant. A series of personal tragedies followed. Within a year, both his sister Mildred and his mother-in-law died. In October 1857, his father-in-law, George Washington Parke Custis, the only father figure Lee had ever known, passed away. Shortly afterward, Lee also lost his favorite horse, which ran off and was never recovered. Lee returned to Arlington to manage the Custis estate, which had fallen into severe disrepair after years of neglect. Custis had effectively left his 196 enslaved people to manage their own lives in his later years, requiring only that they grow food for themselves. The change in ownership brought uncertainty and fear, as the enslaved community at Arlington had remained together since their time at Mount Vernon, spared the family separations common elsewhere. Although Custis's will stipulated that his enslaved people would be freed, Lee used a legal provision allowing him to retain them until the estate's debts were settled. This led some to openly challenge Lee's authority, claiming they were as free as he was, despite having little legal basis for their claims. Among those who resisted were Wesley Norris, his sister Mary, and their cousin George Parks, who fled Arlington in the spring of 1859. They were eventually captured and returned. Reports of their punishment, particularly Norris's whipping, spread widely in abolitionist newspapers, often exaggerated to provoke outrage. While the general punishment was corroborated by witnesses, accounts differed in detail. Norris claimed Lee personally administered the whipping, which would have been highly unlikely for a man of Lee's social standing, and may have been alleged to damage his reputation. On October 17, 1859, J.E.B. Stuart arrived at Arlington with urgent orders for Lee to report to the War Department. Abolitionist John Brown and 18 followers had seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, killing civilians and taking hostages. Lee and Stuart were dispatched by special train to take command of the situation from local militia forces who had trapped Brown's men inside the engine house. When Brown refused to surrender, U.S. Marines under Lee stormed the building, resulting in the deaths of 1 Marine and 2 of Brown's men. Lee dismissed the raid as the reckless act of a fanatic, doomed to fail. Alongside figures such as Thomas J. Wallstreet, Edmund Ruffin, and John Wilkes Booth, Lee witnessed Brown's execution, unaware that the raid had ignited the fuse leading to civil war. In February 1860, Lee was ordered back to Texas as sectional tensions intensified. Many Southern officers were relieved of their duties amid rising talk of secession. Lee was appalled by the idea of dissolving the Union, viewing it as anarchy. He swore never to take arms against the United States, yet he believed his ultimate loyalty lay with his state. If Virginia seceded, Lee resolved to defend her, even at the cost of his life. The decision rested with a state convention, and uncertainty lingered. On March 13, 1861, Lee attended a reception from military officers at the White House, where he met President Abraham Lincoln for the first and only time. Lincoln, aware of Lee's wavering allegiance, offered him command as colonel of the 1st Regiment of Cavalry. Before Lee could fully consider the offer, events overtook diplomacy. In early April, Lincoln ordered the resupply of Fort Sumter, prompting Confederate forces under Beauregard to open fire on April 12, 1861. Edmund Ruffin is credited with firing one of the first shots of the war. Fort Sumter fell 2 days later. General Wincott Scott pressed Lee to declare his loyalty. Unable to fight against Virginia, Lee resigned his U.S. Army commission on April 20, 1861, and traveled to Richmond. Though he had not sought Confederate command, he soon learned he would be offered a leading role. His fate became inextricably tied to Virginia. Virginia officially seceded on May 23, 1861. Soon after, Union forces crossed the Potomac and occupied parts of the state, including Lee's home at Arlington. The estate was seized and later converted into a military cemetery. Under Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, Union dead were buried around the house to ensure the Lee family could never return. Lee was initially denied command at the First Battle of Bull Run and later failed to dislodge Union forces from Cheat Mountain. Redemption came in the spring of 1862 when he assumed command after General Joseph E. Johnston was wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines. That summer, Union General McClellan launched the Peninsula Campaign to capture Richmond. In response, Lee ordered A.P. Hill to strike the Union flank on June 26, 1862, beginning a series of engagements known as the 7 Days Battles. Though costly, the campaign was a Confederate tactical victory, forcing McClellan to retreat. President Lincoln, dismayed by McClellan's caution, soon replaced him with General Pope. In August 1862, Lee learned that General John Pope would soon receive reinforcements from George McClellan's army, effectively doubling the Union's available strength. Lee responded by calling for Stonewall Jackson to join the Army of Northern Virginia so they could strike Pope before the enlarged Union force could fully consolidate. At the Second Battle of Bull Run, Jackson's men held firm, while Lee's main Uderdall, led by General James Longstreet, smashed into Pope's right flank and drove it back across Bull Run. Pope's defeat was decisive. He was removed from command, and the Union once again turned to McClellan. With Union forces pushed back, Lee chose to carry the war northward and invaded Maryland. He sent Jackson toward Harper's Ferry to eliminate the large Union garrison there, while Longstreet advanced farther north. Lee planned to reunite his army, around 40,000 men, and confront McClellan, even though McClellan's army substantially outnumbered his own. To deal with Harper's Ferry, Lee divided his forces, an extremely dangerous choice that left him vulnerable to a rapid Union strike. The risk nearly became a catastrophe when McClellan obtained a copy of Lee's operational orders, famously known as Special Order 191. McClellan moved quickly, attacking and pushing Confederate forces back at South Mountain. Yet even this setback bought Lee enough time to concentrate his army and select ground for a major battle. Lee chose to fight near Sharpsburg, along Antietam Creek. In hindsight, it was a tactical blunder. Sharpsburg sat in a near trap. The Potomac River boxed Lee in on two sides, with Antietam Creek on the third, leaving only a narrow route for retreat back into Virginia. Still, McClellan's cautious and often disjointed command style prevented the Union from exploiting this advantage. He made several costly mistakes, keeping large reserves idle, failing to coordinate attacks effectively, and misusing cavalry and corps-level assets that might have shattered Lee's army. On September 17, 1862, the Union assault began. McClellan struck Lee's left and center near the Hagerstown Pike, with another major effort planned against the Confederate right. One of the fiercest fights erupted at the Sunken Road, later known as the Bloody Lane, where D.H. Hill's division held a critical position. As pressure mounted, the Confederate line at the Bloody Lane weakened, and in a moment of confusion, part of it collapsed and fled. Even then, Union command failed to capitalize, momentum stalled, and the breakthrough was not exploited. Earlier in the day, McClellan had ordered Ambrose Burnside to attack the bridge crossing on the Confederate right, but Burnside moved slowly. His troops charged the crossing repeatedly until they finally broke through the defenders. For a moment, Lee's right wing appeared close to collapse. The battle was steadied only when A.P. Hill's division, force-marched from Harper's Ferry, arrived just in time and struck Burnside's corps, driving it back toward Antietam. As the crisis eased, Lee and Jackson discussed whether a counterattack against the Union right flank could turn the battle. But the conditions were unfavorable. Union positions near the Potomac limited the feasibility of a wide flanking maneuver. Any counterstroke would have required Jackson's corps to march through a corridor less than a mile wide under dangerous artillery fire. Jackson attempted to silence Union guns, often linked in accounts with Meade's sector, using light smoothbore pieces under Jeb Stuart's support, but those guns were quickly overwhelmed. Within minutes, the attempt collapsed. Jackson concluded a counterattack was not viable and ordered his men back into position. Antietam became the single bloodiest day in American history, with roughly 22,700 casualties combined. Lee eventually yielded the field, but McClellan failed to pursue, turning a battlefield advantage into a strategic disappointment. McClellan's hesitation once again cost him his command. The outcome at Antietam had enormous political consequences. Lincoln used the moment to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862, declaring that enslaved people in areas still in rebellion would be freed. Though it did not immediately enforce freedom everywhere, it reshaped the war's purpose and accelerated the flight of enslaved people toward Union lines, where many would later bolster Union manpower. By mid-November, Ambrose Burnside took command of the Army of the Potomac and advanced toward Fredericksburg, Virginia, crossing the Rappahannock. Tactically, Burnside committed a major error by failing to move swiftly while Lee was still repositioning. Heavy rains and flooding delayed operations long enough for Lee to entrench in a powerful defensive line. As Union engineers attempted to lay pontoon bridges under Confederate fire, Burnside ordered artillery bombardments of Fredericksburg to suppress snipers. The shelling failed to stop the resistance and effectively revealed Burnside's intentions. Jackson's troops were called up from positions around Skinker Neck and Port Royal, while Brigadier General Brigham William Barksdale was tasked with delaying the crossing. Barksdale's defense became ferocious. As Burnside tried to cross, his men contested the landing so fiercely that it became one of the war's first truly opposed river crossings. His small force refused to abandon Fredericksburg, fighting through narrow streets and houses in what became one of the earliest examples of serious urban combat in the Civil War. Eventually, as Union strength built, Barksdale was forced back. On December 12th, additional brigades entered Fredericksburg, and despite officers' orders to stop, large-scale looting followed as the city was sacked. Burnside spent December 12th moving his army into position. His plan was to have Sumner's Grand Division slam into Longstreet's left, while Franklin struck Jackson's right in a pincer action. But Lee had positioned his army along commanding ridge lines and behind strong defensive works, particularly the stone wall and heights that dominated the open approaches. Burnside's strategy turned suicidal. Regiment after regiment marched into concentrated fire toward Mary's Heights. From behind stone walls and protected ground, Confederate defenders slaughtered wave after wave. Union casualties soared, far exceeding Lee's losses. Burnside considered continuing the attack, but his generals urged withdrawal. His disastrous performance led to his replacement by General Hooker. In May 1863, Lee faced Hooker at Chancellorsville, Virginia. Hooker was bold in planning, splitting his army into multiple columns, one moving along the southern bank of the Rappahannock, while others advanced through the tangled wilderness toward Chancellorsville. His intent was to double envelop Lee, striking front and rear simultaneously. Yet Hooker also sent much of his cavalry off to a raid toward Richmond, leaving him dangerously blind to Lee's movements. Lee seized the opportunity with audacity. He split his own forces as well, sending Jubal Early with around 10,000 men to hold Fredericksburg and deter General Sedgwick, while Lee took the bulk of his army to face Hooker. The move caught Hooker off guard, and Hooker pulled back forces that had been in strong positions, forcing them to withdraw through the wilderness and lose their advantage. Jackson followed cautiously and met Lee that night. Lee was badly outnumbered, especially because Longstreet's corps had been detached south of Richmond for supply and defensive duties. Even so, the Army of Northern Virginia chose aggression over defense. Jackson executed one of the war's most daring maneuvers, a long flank march, about 16 miles, around the Union right flank, aimed at General Oliver O. Howard's 11th Corps. On evening May 2nd at 5 p.m., Jackson deployed 4 brigades and gave a simple order: "You may go forward." His attack struck like a storm. Wildlife reportedly burst from the woods as if fleeing a fire, and the Union 11th Corps was rolled up in panic, driven from the field in chaos. As night fell and the line shifted, Lee rode forward with a few officers to scout. In the darkness, returning Confederates were mistaken for Union cavalry by their own men and fired upon. Jackson was critically wounded and later died 8 days afterwards, reportedly from complications including pneumonia. Lee was devastated and famously said, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." After Jackson fell, A.P. Hill, who had his own tensions with Jackson, was wounded as well. Command of the Corps passed to J.E.B. Stuart, a brilliant cavalryman but inexperienced at leading infantry formations. He paused until he could receive direction. Even so, Lee and Stuart pressed coordinated attacks as Union command faltered. Hooker himself had been stunned early in the fighting when a cannonball struck the building where he was positioned. By the morning of May 3rd, the Union Army withdrew across the Rappahannock, leaving Chancellorsville to Lee. At the same time, Lee learned that Sedgwick.
After Chancellorsville, Lee reorganized his army. He expanded it from 2 corps into 3, retaining James Longstreet and elevating A.P. Hill and Richard S. Ewell to corps command. The structure, however, was uneven. Longstreet had deep experience, Ewell often proved hesitant, and Hill could be almost too aggressive, traits that would matter greatly in the campaign ahead. Lee marched his army, roughly 75,000 men, north into Pennsylvania, and in time the 2 armies converged around the small town of Gettysburg. Union General Joseph Hooker pursued Lee at first, but he was soon replaced by George G. Meade, who maneuvered to place his army between Lee and Washington, D.C. Compounding Lee's difficulties, J.E.B. Stuart, uncharacteristically, rode off on a wide raid to the north, hoping to redeem his embarrassment at Brandy Station by harassing Union lines and gathering supplies. Instead, he deprived Lee of cavalry reconnaissance, leaving Lee dangerously blind to the Union Army's exact position. Gettysburg, Day 1, July 1, 1863. On July 1st, Union cavalry under Brigadier General John Buford took up positions on McPherson's Ridge. When elements of Henry Heth's Confederate division appeared, Buford fought a delaying action to hold the high ground until Union infantry arrived. Just as Buford's men were close to being forced back, Major General John Reynolds and the Union I Corps reached the field. Reynolds was killed while directing troops into the line, an early blow to Union leadership. At first, Confederate attacks were poorly coordinated, but by early afternoon, the Union line broke and retreated through Gettysburg in disorder, choking the town's streets. Lee then issued what would become one of his most debated instructions. He directed Ewell to seize Cemetery Hill, if practicable. Ewell, new to Corps command and cautious by nature, judged the position too difficult to take immediately and chose to halt and rest his men. That decision mattered. By nightfall, Union forces had consolidated along Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and Culp's Hill, forming a strong defensive position that would anchor the battle. That evening, Longstreet urged Lee to rethink the plan, swing south, place the Confederate Army between Meade and Washington, D.C., and force the Union to attack on Confederate terms. Lee, however, was determined to crush the Army of the Potomac outright. Gettysburg, Day 2, July 2, 1863. On July 2nd, Lee focused on attacking the Union flanks. The Union line formed a fishhook shape, strong, compact, and able to shift reinforcements quickly. Yet, a major opportunity appeared when Union Corps Commander Daniel Sickles disobeyed orders, pushed forward from the main line, and occupied the peach orchard, creating a dangerous bulge and leaving gaps behind him. Lee seized the mistake. Longstreet, supported by divisions such as Hood's, was sent to smash Sickles' exposed position, while Hill pressured the center and Ewell was tasked with attacking towards Cemetery Hill and the Union right. Longstreet's assault overran Sickles' advanced line. Fierce fighting erupted around Little Round Top, defended in part by the 20th Maine. The position was critical. If Little Round Top fell, the Union Army could be rolled up from the flank. On the opposite end, Ewell's evening attacks broke into parts of the Union position, but Union reinforcements arrived in time to seal the breach and push Confederates back. Gettysburg, Day 3, July 3, 1863. By the third day, Lee believed the Union center was weakened. In theory, after intense fighting on both flanks, that assumption could have been reasonable, but Meade had anticipated Lee might strike the center and reinforced it. Even though Lee had already been effectively checked, he chose to gamble on a frontal blow, what would become known as Pickett's charge. Some accounts suggest Lee had suffered a medical episode earlier in 1863, possibly cardiac in nature, and historians have debated whether illness affected his judgment. Whatever the cause, the decision was catastrophic. Pickett's division, along with supporting formations, had to cross nearly a mile of open ground under artillery fire, then face concentrated rifle volleys at close range. Lee began with a massive artillery barrage intended to soften the Union center, but the bombardment failed to neutralize the target. Much of the Confederate fire overshot or proved ineffective, while Union gunners conserved ammunition and waited. Then the assault advanced. Only when the Confederate lines emerged into open view, past the point of no return, did Union artillery open with full force. The attacking formations were shredded. Those who reached the Union line were killed or captured, and Pickett's division was shattered. Gettysburg broke the momentum of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee retreated back to Virginia, having lost more than a third of his army over 3 days. After that, Lee would not seriously take the offensive again. The next great clash came on May 4, 1864, at the Battle of the Wilderness, where Lee faced Ulysses S. Grant. Grant's overland campaign and the end. In the Wilderness, Longstreet was wounded by friendly fire and would be out of action for months. Lee and Grant engaged in brutal, continuous fighting, counterattack after counterattack, until Lee's men, fearing for his safety, physically guided his horse to the rear when he tried to lead from the front. Lee pulled back to Spotsylvania and prepared for Grant's renewed assaults. Grant then pressed on through a grinding campaign that culminated in the disastrous Union attack at Cold Harbor in June. Though Grant had numerical superiority, he shifted strategy after Cold Harbor into a prolonged siege, Petersburg, lasting from June 1864 to April 1865. When Petersburg finally fell, Lee was forced into retreat. Richmond could no longer be held and fell on April 3, 1865. Grant pursued relentlessly with cavalry leaders such as Philip Sheridan and officers like George Armstrong Custer, cutting off supply lines, striking wagons, and blocking escape routes. The pressure became unbearable. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The terms were far more generous than Lee expected. Officers were allowed to keep their sidearms. Private horses and baggage were protected from seizure. Soldiers were paroled and permitted to return home so long as they honored the parole conditions. Lee supervised the disarming and dissolution of his army for several days, and then returned toward Richmond. The Civil War officially concluded soon after, with Confederate forces continuing to surrender through the spring of 1865. After the war and Lee's death. After the war, Lee lived a comparatively quiet life and accepted the presidency of Washington College. He was frequently attacked by Northern newspapers, accused of bringing up rebels, even as he attempted to steer Southerners away from bitterness. He criticized prominent ex-Confederates, such as Davis and Jubal Early, for inflammatory outbursts that kept old wounds open. Lee lost citizenship and voting rights due to his role in the rebellion,
though these rights would later be restored through post-war amnesty measures under President Andrew Johnson. On September 28, 1870, after a normal workday, a church meeting, and supper at home, Lee suffered a stroke. As he attempted to say grace, no words came. After 2 weeks of decline, Robert E. Lee died on October 10, 1870, at 10 a.m. Legacy and the debate around Lee. Robert E. Lee holds a complicated place in American history. Admirers have described him in grand terms: a Caesar without ambition, a Napoleon without selfishness, and so on. Yet modern judgment cannot ignore that his cause was tied to a confederacy built to preserve slavery. Lee is often romanticized through the lost cause narrative, which portrays the Confederate fight as noble and righteous. Many historians argue that this framing distorts the war's central realities. Lee himself, in some accounts, opposed the glorification of Confederate symbols through statues and monuments, believing it could prevent national healing. Even so, the moral question remains: was Lee an honorable defender of Virginia, or was he wrong to fight for a slaveholding rebellion? Historians such as Elizabeth Brown Pryor argue that Lee's greatness is tempting to believe in because he possessed elements of greatness, yet falls short because true greatness requires moral courage and far-sighted action. Lee acknowledged slavery's immorality in private, but did not act decisively against the institution, and resisted many forms of post-war change that could have improved the world he lived in. Hello guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy our work and would like to support the channel,